Hi, welcome to Digital Defense. My name is Jordan Robertson. I'm a cybersecurity reporter with Bloomberg here in Washington, D.C. This is our weekly cybersecurity show, and as always, we delve into topics of the week and try to provide some tips and tricks that you can use. And today, there is no bigger story in cybersecurity right now than the Petya ransomware worm that spread around the world this week. And I'm going to try to take a little bit of a different tack than maybe some other shows you might have seen on this, and try to offer you some tips and tricks for preventing yourself from getting hit by one of these ransomware worms. These things are nasty. These things are hard to prevent, but there are some basic internet hygiene things you can do that might help you. So as always, this is an audience-driven show. We're broadcasting live now out on Facebook Live and Periscope, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg terminal. So if you have any questions for me, please feel free to put them in the comment section, and we are monitoring those communication forums, and we will be answering as many questions as we can today. So let's just dive right into it. You know, the big news of the week is that there was this big ransomware outbreak that started in Ukraine and spread around the globe. Now, it wasn't ultimately as destructive as initially some analysts and experts might have feared. However, it is another reminder that when it comes to ransomware, this is the new go-to hack for cyber criminals. This is like, one analyst told me, they said this is the perfect crime. If you can get your hands on some ransomware and you've got a few technical skills and a little bit of a technical know-how, what you can do is make a whole lot of money very easily, and that appears to be the case with a lot of these attacks. But there are some interesting quirks to this attack that make it a little sexier and a little bit more potentially sinister that I want to get into. First things first, what is ransomware? Ransomware is not a new type of attack. Ransomware is a hacker breaks into your computer, they encrypt your data, which means you can't unlock it without a key that only they have, and they demand money for it. Now, in the past, again, as I say, this is not a new phenomenon, but in the past, it was much harder to get paid as a hacker. A lot of cybersecurity experts don't like this line of reporting, but it's true. The rise of Bitcoin, the rise of digital currencies has absolutely helped enable a lot of these attacks. It hasn't caused one or the other, but it has helped make it easier. So in the days of old, if you got hit with a ransomware attack, just paying the hacker was much more difficult. You're talking about wire transfers and fake bank accounts and this and that. It's just much more difficult. Today, what you were getting, what these victims of this attack were getting, was a locked computer screen that said, pay us $300 in Bitcoin, or else you'll never get your data back. So on its own, this is something that all of us need to be aware of. And I'll get into some of the intricacies of this attack that make it actually, according to experts, less of a ransomware attack and more of potentially a smokescreen, just a straight-up destructive attack that has nothing at all to do with collecting money. But I'll get to that in a minute. The really important thing, I think, for this audience, and again, we're taking questions live here, so any questions you have, please feel free to send them. We're getting some good ones in already. I'll start with this, though. The most important thing to remember when you read about these attacks is some of them are just simply not preventable. The WannaCry worm from last month, for example, that infected hundreds of thousands of computers around the world. And the reason that was so effective was it spread using a leaked exploit from the National Security Agency here in the U.S. And it was a highly effective vulnerability to exploit that allowed kind of self-propagation. It spread on networks that were unpatched. Microsoft had issued a fix to that particular vulnerability before the worm spread. But nevertheless, not everybody patches right away. Some people don't patch at all. So that worm spread pretty quickly. This one also used that capability, but so many computers had been fixed since then, in the last month and a half, that it didn't spread as quickly that way, but it had other ways of spreading. So the big point is some of these worms are simply not preventable if you're talking about a computer, especially on a corporate network. If your corporation is not doing a good job of monitoring what computers can talk to each other on a network, and specifically what they can do to each other on a network, there's really nothing you can do to prevent this from happening. For a home user, however, there are some really basic things you can do. And my biggest advice is not so much about how do you prevent yourself from getting hit by one of these things, because as I say, if they're spreading computer to computer without user interaction, which in some cases, in the last two attacks, in some cases they were, you can't really prevent that. There are ways that you can tweak the technology on your computer, on your network to prevent that from happening. But for the average user, the basic advice is the simplest, which is back up your computer. If you're worried about your home computer being affected by one of these things, the strongest measure of protection you can get is not some fancy security software. It is not the latest gadget that the security industry is trying to sell you. It is simply to back up your data routinely. Apple makes this very easy with iCloud. Microsoft has very easy services as well. It used to be backing up was a cumbersome thing where you had to plug in a hard drive, and it was this complicated process where you had to physically do something all the time. And it was kind of a hassle. Nowadays, it's so easy to just set your computer to auto backup. Some people don't like it because you are entrusting a third party, such as Apple or Microsoft or Dropbox, which we've covered on the show, with your personal data. However, I'm a big fan of it. I think for the ordinary person, this is the strongest mechanism to protect against these kind of attacks. Because guess what? If they encrypt your data and you can't get it back, you can either throw away the computer or you can just erase the operating system and reinstall it. You just junk it. I mean, junk the software on it, and you have a backup that you can automatically import. So that's one tip. I've got a few more in a minute. Again, we're getting some great questions, so we're going to try to get to a lot of these. Again, feel free to write them in the comments section, and we'll get to a lot of these here on the show. First question here is, what countermeasures are being taken by governments to defeat these ransomware attacks? Well, two answers to that question. One is, any government, whether it's the U.S. government or others, they have network monitoring. So they monitor attackers' infrastructure. That's the way governments typically work. That's the most broad-based signals intelligence type activity. So when these types of attacks happen, they look for what's called command and control servers. And this is something the government truly is the best at because they can see across the entire internet. And when attackers start establishing these command and control servers, these are servers from which they launch attacks, communicate with their infected computers, tell them to do more bad things. Governments can take those servers down with a law enforcement order, cooperation between countries, this and that. Interesting thing about this Petya, this latest iteration of this Petya ransomware, it doesn't appear to have any command and control at all. At least any that the security research community has seen, which has led a lot of people to believe this is not something, this is not a series of infections that the attackers have any real intention of decrypting. So anybody who's paid the ransom, the security community is urging people, don't pay the ransom on this one. Unlike many ransomware attacks in which paying the ransom will actually get you the data back, in this case, that's probably not going to happen because these attackers really have no way to communicate with these computers they've infected. So please, don't pay the ransom. That's the best advice that I've heard now. Next question here is, what are the most infected operating systems? The answer is always going to be Windows. The answer is always going to be Windows because that's still the most used operating system on the planet. And it's not that Microsoft is doing a bad job with security. Quite to the contrary. Microsoft used to do a bad job with security. I mean, you talk about 20 years ago. But they got religion on this, and they have a world-class cybersecurity team, and they work very hard to secure these systems. The problem is, it's just like with Android. There's a close analog there. When you have tens of millions or hundreds of millions of devices running your software, they're not going to be updated all at once. It's not like a company pushes out a patch, whether it's Microsoft or Google or whoever, and all the devices are instantly magically updated. People have to do this, and people don't want to be disrupted in their work or their leisure on their computers. And companies don't want to just push out patches that might damage their systems or disrupt their operations. So that gives attackers a big threat vector to continue to exploit. I mean, you could write malware against Apple and iPhone and the Mac. It's just not as big of an attack vector. So these two malware samples have affected Windows operating systems. So it's just really important to remember if you're running a Windows machine, which many of us are. Let's see here. We've got, is there anything you can do beforehand to avoid it? Well, getting back to my initial point, some of these ransomware attacks, the best way to prevent them is not necessarily to block them, because in some cases you just can't. That does lead to a feeling of helplessness, but there is stuff you can do, and that's why my advice, specifically when it comes to ransomware, is, have all your patches up to date, have all your latest antivirus, whatever flavor of antivirus. The free stuff is actually pretty good, so I would urge you to download one of those programs programs if that's something you're interested in. But most importantly, set your backups. Like, I think it's okay to set your backups to a cloud provider and just fine tune it. Like, if you have family photos that are really, really personal and really important, maybe you do those on a separate hard drive or a thumb drive or something like that. If you're really worried about sharing it with a third party, such as Microsoft or Apple or whoever. But just back up. It's so simple these days to set automatic backup on your PCs or Macs that really everybody should be doing it, and set a strong password so nobody can log in and take your files that way. But that's actually the best way to prevent these attacks, not from infecting your system, but from being effective against you. And I think that's just a really important message. What antivirus or anti-malware software can catch this malware? Well, as you can imagine, once one of these attacks happen, the entire cybersecurity community pounces on it, and they write what they call our signatures, which are basically fingerprints of this specific type of malware that helps their antivirus engines block it. So at this point, the attack's been ongoing for a couple of days. You can reasonably expect that most, if not all, of the major antivirus vendors are going to have a signature for this. So it's not necessarily that one's going to be better than the other, and a lot of those competitors in that industry have decided not to compete on data, so they share a lot of this information. So basically, any of the major vendors should be fine in terms of blocking it. The bigger question is, how do you prepare for the next one? And that's where backups become really important. Next question here is, does using a VPN, which is a virtual private network, help, or is that under attack as well? It's an interesting question. VPNs give you a greater degree of privacy online. Generally, they're a pretty good thing to use if you're concerned about somebody eavesdropping on your communications. But that doesn't necessarily protect you against attacks like ransomware, because ultimately what you're doing is you're still connecting back to your home computer. So the security that comes with a VPN, typically what security professionals refer to, is anti-eavesdropping technology. It makes it harder to just passively surveil your traffic. And that's a huge benefit, but that's not necessarily what you would use if you're trying to prevent a ransomware attack, at least the flavors that we've seen so far. Another question here. We're getting some good ones today. Please keep them coming in the comments section of wherever you're watching this show. We love the questions. Does it matter if you have an Android or iOS? Well, these flavors of malware are affecting primarily Windows computers. However, we have seen mobile versions of this kind of thing as well. It's just a little bit harder to spread. There's a big difference, and there's an interesting difference here in the way that PCs, desktops, work computers connect to each other versus the way that phones connect to each other. A lot of people don't know this, but the cell phone providers have really amazing visibility into and control over what happens on their network. So you just simply don't see these kind of mass outbreaks on cellular networks for a couple of reasons. One, phones are being attacked less now. That's likely going to change. But also the telcos, the mobile network providers, they have amazing visibility into and control over what happens on their network. So they're able to shut these kinds of things down very, very quickly. So for the hackers, it's usually just not worth their time and effort to attack phones in this way. But again, that's changing. Another question here is, did the people who started this attack get caught yet? I wouldn't say caught. I mean, I haven't seen any headlines that anybody's been arrested. However, they have been out there publicly. I mean, people we believe to be behind this attack. It really could be a smokescreen as well. But these attackers sometimes like to claim credit, and a lot of the times I caution people, I urge them to take any hacker claim of credit for these things with a big grain of salt and a big dose of skepticism. Because one of the really interesting things about this attack was that it appeared to be ransomware. By all measures, this was a ransomware attack. Your screen flashed red, it told you to pay 300 Bitcoin to get your data back. That's a ransomware attack. But again, some of these really, really odd characteristics of this malware, the fact it didn't have an apparent command and control system, the attackers didn't really seem to have a way to decrypt any of this data, and they also didn't appear to have a way to collect, in reality, any money that people would give them, has led a lot of people to believe that this was just a straight-up destructive attack disguised as ransomware. Now, why would you do that, you may ask? The answer is pretty clear. If you're trying to create a smokescreen and create a diversion version and to create chaos. This is an easy way to do it, and it should be noted that the primary target of this attack and the primary place that was infected was Ukraine. And as we all know, Ukraine is at war, basically with Russia, and they are the target of some of the most sophisticated cyber attacks we've seen. So this may well just be part of that as well, and just masquerading as ransomware. Another question here is, how should a victim of ransomware attack immediately respond? Well, I kind of have two pieces of advice about this. One, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to back up. So if you're doing routine backups, you really don't need to worry too much about the ransomware, because as I say, you could wipe your operating system, reinstall it, and you should be fine. There are some caveats there, but in general, it's just not something you're going to have to worry a lot about. However, there are cases if you're a corporation or you're in charge of security for a corporation. Many corporations pay the ransom. If you think about it, there's an interesting quirk to ransomware that I've found pretty compelling. Most ransomware does not ask for millions of dollars. Most ransomware asks for a few $100s in Bitcoin or less. I mean, in some cases, it's just dollars or pennies on the dollar. The reason for that is the hackers have figured out if you charge too much, if you force people to or demand that people pay too much money to decrypt their computers, many people are just going to say, forget it, I'm not going to do that. But if you can figure out, I guess, the sweet spot of how much can you charge and make a good profit as the attacker and get enough people to pay, it seems to be around this few $100 range. So for corporations that are hit by this stuff, if it's a few $100s or even a few thousand, the advantage of paying that money and having a reasonable chance of getting their data back, it's just a drop in the bucket. Many corporations do that, and many corporations do that, in fact, at the request of the FBI, who tell them this might be the easiest way to get your data back. And that's a valid response. Now, there was a case of a South Korean web hosting company that just this month paid what many experts believe is the biggest ransom, digital ransom payment on record, which was over $1 million. So that sets a new standard and shows you why this type of attack is just so valuable. That is the easiest money these attackers have probably ever made. They may not have even known what they hit when they hit it, that they hit these servers of this company, that these servers are very important. So I say all that to say this is a super lucrative field, and if you get hit by it, don't discount the fact that in many of these cases, the ransomware operators do actually decrypt the file. So if you haven't backed up, we're not about victim shaming on this show. We're all humans trying to do the best we can with this stuff. In many cases, it makes sense to pay if you can afford it, and especially if you're a company. That's especially true. Another question here. Again, we're getting some great ones. Thank you all for submitting them, and happy to take many more. If the ransomware operators are demanding Bitcoin, how would someone who knows nothing about Bitcoin go about getting them? This is actually a really good question, because in the security community and as a journalist covering this, we talk about these things as if they're easy. But for most of us, actually paying the ransom would actually be difficult. It's much easier to go to the grocery store and figure out how to do a wire transfer than in many cases it is how to pay somebody in Bitcoin. The short answer to this is if you Google Bitcoin exchanges and Bitcoin wallets, basically all you have to do is create a Bitcoin wallet, figure out how to deposit some money into it. Again, these are financial services organizations and applications. Many of them make it very easy to figure out how to go about doing this. If it's not part of your normal life, it may seem a little bit confusing and daunting, but go Google Bitcoin wallet. And they'll help you create a Bitcoin wallet. They'll help you put money into those accounts. Sometimes those are direct deposits, or you link it with a bank account, or whatever your preferred method is, or just depositing cash. But you can buy Bitcoins digitally. You put them in your wallet, you send them to an account. It's basically just a number or a web address, and that goes into an account. But again, in this particular ransomware case, don't pay the ransom. If you're a victim, don't pay the ransom. You're probably not going to get your data back, but this could be a learning experience going forward for all of us about data backups and such. Another question here is a permanent connected external hard drive in danger also, or just the system drive? You know, I don't really know the answer to that. On this show, I like to be honest with you when I do or don't know the answer. My suspicion is that because the malware targets the computer itself, it's not necessarily targeting a peripheral, that your external drive, in theory, should be fine. Because what this malware is doing is it targets the system that you're on, the Microsoft Windows system that you're on, and all the vulnerable network connections going into it. So my advice would be, in general, if you've got a permanently installed hard drive backup and you're backing up to that, you're ahead of the game, because the point is to back up regularly. And it sounds boring, it sounds cliche, it sounds trite, and it is, but it's absolutely the best way to protect against these things, because as I say, you can't depend on a cybersecurity technology company in all cases to protect you against these attacks. And there's an important reason why that I think we should get into. One of the really hard things about cybersecurity in this particular area is it involves people either clicking on an email and authorizing a set of malicious activities that they never intended to. The problem with that is your computer says, Jordan just clicked yes on this. He is authorizing this process to happen on this machine. Now, if that process is encrypt all the data and demand a Bitcoin ransom, that's of course not what I would want to do on my machine, nor any of us would want to. But the problem becomes when these processes start running on computers, they're running in what's called a privileged mode. They're running in a trusted mode, because either the user clicked on something, or in the case of this ransomware, the operating system is allowing this malware to spread between computers in a trusted way. So you can't just, I've asked cybersecurity professionals this, why can't you just make a signature that says, if I'm going to get ransomware on my computer, why can't it just block that? And they say the problem is this, is that if that process is starting in a trusted, privileged way, again, you were tricked or your network just allowed this behavior to happen, you have fractions of a second for your system to realize, hey, I'm not opening up a web page, I'm initiating a ransomware process. Companies are working on this, though, but there's a very, very short window of time, again, fractions of a second, where a piece of security technology can actually look at that process and say, this is not what the user intended, and stop it. It's an ongoing problem. It's something the industry is trying to solve, but we're not there yet, and lots of companies are trying to understand that better. Another question here is, can't the backup system itself be infected and attacked? Absolutely. If what you're referring to is a hard drive backup, a physical device, it absolutely could be. And if you're talking about a cloud service, those could be attacked as well. But the thing about it is these attacks, for the most part, are low-hanging fruit. They are using known exploits, known vulnerabilities. These are not, even though this was a leaked NSA tool that helped propagate this attack and the other, and WannaCry last month, these were, again, vulnerabilities that had been patched by Microsoft in the Windows operating system. And this is what we find across the cybersecurity threat landscape. Most of these attacks are using known vulnerabilities, known exploits, and known propagation mechanisms or spreading mechanisms. And the important point about that is you have ways to protect yourself against that by simply updating your computer, doing proper internet hygiene, backing things up. But to the question about aren't the backup systems at risk as well, they potentially could be, but you're talking then about a next phase of the attack. So while something could potentially be vulnerable, hackers in most cases go for the easiest kill shot. And in this case is your hard drive on your computer. That's what they're encrypting. Those are the files that they're shielding from you and blocking from you. That's just the easiest way to do it. To add on these other modules and capabilities, certainly possible, certainly likely, but I just wouldn't say that's the main risk you should worry about because it just requires extra work. So with that, I want to thank you all for the questions. Those are some really good ones. As always, we try to provide, I hope, useful information on this show about, it's not all doom and gloom. And if you listen to a lot of these security companies, you might be led to believe that. Ransomware attacks like this, they are very dangerous. They're scary, especially insofar as they affect industrial systems. WannaCry affected hospitals in the UK and shut down some hospital services for a while. But I hope the takeaway from this show is you do have some control over how much these types of attacks can affect you on a personal level. In terms of corporations and services and government services you use, we don't have a lot of control over that, but hopefully better visibility into these things reminds us that these worms, these were things that we saw 10 years ago and kind of went away as hackers moved to stealthier type data stealing attacks. But worms are back, and they're being used to spread ransomware, and I think the best thing we can do is just be aware and be mindful of the fact that these things are out there. You will probably be hit by one of them at one time or another, but if you've done some routine due diligence and basic internet hygiene and are backing up and taking basic security precautions, you'll have a measure of control that hopefully when you see these headlines will give you a sense of there's something you can do about this. So with that, I want to thank you all for watching. We really appreciate your viewership and your questions. Feel free to write me offline. I'm happy to answer questions there as well if I can. I'm on Twitter at JordanR1000, Jordan, the letter R1000. You can also find us on the web at bloomberg.com/ youtube.com/technology. We have old episodes of this show as well as a colleague show called Gadgets with Gurman, where my colleague Mark Gurman reviews the latest and greatest tech gadgets. We also have a great podcast there called Decrypted, so please feel free to check those out. We always appreciate your support. And we'll see you next week here on Digital Defense. We broadcast live every Thursday from at noon Eastern here from the Washington, D.C. Bureau. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.